Good day, everyone. Today, I'll be talking about the environmental conditions at altitude. So, what happens to our body when we are doing some physical activities or some sports in an environment that has a high altitude or low altitude? So, how they affect the human body, especially during physical activity. Clinical issues at altitude have been noted as far back 400 BC. Early exposures focus more on cold temperatures than low air pressures. But it was through the work of several key scientists that we came to understand the real issue. First is in 1644, Torricelli created the mercury biometer. So, the mercury biometer is an instrument that permitted to accurate measurement of atmospheric pressure. And in 1648, Pascal showed that barometric pressure decreases with elevation. And next is in 1777, Lavoisier identified oxygen as a key component of air. And in 1801, John Dalton introduced the concept of partial pressure, and he called it the Dalton's law of partial pressure. So in the Operation Everest 2, in the late 1900s, studies like this Operation Everest 2 used hypobaric chambers to mimic extreme altitudes. These experiments significantly expanded our knowledge of how altitude affects exercise and our human body. So how they classified the altitude. So they categorized altitude into several levels. In the near sea levels below 500 meters, there are no effects in the human body. And in the low altitude, which is 500 to 200 to 2000 meters rather, minor performance drops athletes may be affected. So the performance of the athletes was affected due to the altitudes to the lower altitude. Right. Sorry. Moderate altitude. So that it is 2000 to 3000 meter. Noticeable decline in aerobic performance because the air in the moderate altitude, just like in the Mexico City, it is there are heavy air to breathe like that, and especially it is colder, sometimes warmer, and the athletes wasn't they are not used to it. And the high altitude 3000 to 5500 meters. Risk of altitude sickness, acclimation helps, but performance still drops. And the last is extreme altitudes, above 5500 meters. Severe hypoxia, even dangerous. It means, just for example, in the Mount Everest, you can experience frostbites and anything that your body can't handle. For discussions on performance, we typically focus on altitudes above 1,500 meters. So atmospheric pressure is simply the weight of the air above us. So at the sea level, the barometric pressure is 760 mmHg, and at the top of Mount Everest, it's only about 250 mmHg, which is it is very low, and there are no human that can survive that longer. This drop in pressure means less oxygen is available. Even though the percentage of the oxygen in the air remains constant, which is the 20.93%, the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, reducing the amount of our bodies can absorb. Because we can't absorb the oxygen of a place that normally decreases. Effects on the body. With lower oxygen pressure, oxygen transfers from lungs to blood becomes less efficient. Less oxygen reaches muscles and tissues. This results in decreased endurance, slower recovery, and overall fatigue of our body. Air temperature and humidity. Temperatures also drops as we ascend about 1 Celsius per 150 meters. On Everest, average temperatures can reach negative 40 Celsius. Additionally, cold air holds less water, so the air is so dry. This causes increased dehydration through our skin and respiratory evaporation. Combined with the cold, this can lead to hypothermia and frostbite. And solar radiation. High altitude environments also mean more intense solar radiation. So why? There's less atmospheres to filter UV rays. There's also less water vapor to absorb radiation. Snow reflects sunlight, increasing exposure. This means more risk of sunburns and eye damage like snow blindness. And in summary, to high altitude is a hypobaric environment, meaning lower air pressure. Oxygen availability drops with altitude due to the lower partial pressure of oxygen or PO2. The air is colder and drier, leading to dehydration and cold-related illness. Solar radiation increases, making protection essential. Understanding these conditions is critical for anyone venturing to high elevations, whether hiking, climbing, competing, or doing some physical activities. Thanks for your attention, everyone. This is me. I am Noel Town. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I am Almaros Tabak and my topic that I'm going to discuss it's all about physiological responses to acute altitude exposure. So when we say physiological responses to acute altitude exposure, it's all about the human body response to high altitudes with various physiological changes, mainly, mainly affecting respiratory, cardiovascular, and metabolic systems. These changes can impact exercises and sports performance. Most studies focus on healthy young men with limited research on women, children, and elderly populations. So let's move on to respiratory system. So adequate oxygen supply to muscles is crucial for physical performance. Any limitation in oxygen intake, transfer, transport, or taken, uptake can impair performance, especially at high altitudes. And so this means that for muscles um, to work properly during exercise is they need sufficient supply of oxygen. if there's if there's a problem at any stage of getting oxygen into the body and to the muscles, like at high altitude, it can negatively impact physical performance. So the next is pulmonary ventilations. Um, at high altitude, the body increases breathing rate and depth to compensate for lower oxygen levels, helping to take in more oxygen. So this means that at high altitude, the body adapts to lower oxygen the body adapt to lower oxygen levels by increasing breathing rate and depth. The physiological response help take in in more oxygen, attempting to maintain an adequate oxygen supply to the body's tissues and support vital functions. Then in pulmonary diffusions is it's oxygen transfer at high altitudes. So at rest, the lungs can still efficiently transfer oxygens from the air into the blood, and even at high altitude, the main issue is the lower oxygen levels in the uh, air alveoli, alveoli, which leads to lower oxygen levels in the blood, which is hypoxemia. The lungs' ability to diffuse oxygen isn't the limiting factor. Then, kanang next is for the oxygen transport. An oxygen transport at high altitude is first is a lower alveolar or PO2 a lower alveolar PO2 reduces hemoglobin saturations with oxygen. Then ang ikadua is the A shapes ng oxyhemoglobin. This dissociations curve helps minimize disasturations. And ay katulo is kana even at high altitude, hemoglobin still binds to oxygen, um, albeit at lower saturations levels, around 80% at 4,300 m, and the curve's shapes allows for relatively efficient oxygen binding, mitigating the effects of lower oxygen levels. The next is and adaptations to high altitude is a second adaptation occurs early in altitude exposure, which is first is um, respiratory al- alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis. Um, Respiratory alkalosis increases blood pH. Nang increases pH shifts the anang oxyhemoglobin oxy ba ni oxyhemoglobin dissociations curve left. Then next is number 2 is this shifts increases oxygen binding to hemoglobin if ay in lungs. Then ang ikatulo is as a result, hemoglobin saturation increases 89% versus 80%. So these adaptations help maintain oxygen delivery to tissue at high. And gas exchange at altitude is at the high altitude is first is arterial PO2 decreases 42 mmHg versus 100 mmHg at sea level. And ang ikadwa is tissue PO2 and also decreases, and it's 27 mmHg versus 40 mmHg at sea level. At sea level. Then ikatulo is the diffusion gradient, driving oxygen into tissues, is greatly reduced to 15 mmHg versus 60 mmHg at sea level. Um, a 75% reduction. So this reduce this reduce um, diffusion's gradient impairs oxygen's delivery to tissues um, significantly impacting exercise performance at high altitudes. And the next is our cardiovascular responses to altitude. So, uh, at the respiratory systems become increasingly limiting, uh, mm, um, increasingly limiting. At altitudes, the cardiovascular systems, the cardiovascular systems likewise undergoes sub undergoes substantial changes to attempt to compensate for the decrease in arterial PO that accompanies hypoxia. Hypoxia and the next is our cardiovascular responses to altitude. So, uh, at the respiratory systems become increasingly limiting, uh, mm, um, increasingly limiting. At altitudes, the cardiovascular systems, the cardiovascular systems likewise undergoes sub s- undergoes substantial changes to attempt to compensate for the decrease in arterial PO that accompanies hypoxia. Hypoxia on pronunciation. And so there are cardiac outputs at high altitude. So first is reduce arterial PO2 limits oxygen delivery to muscle. So ang ikadwa is cardiac output increases initially to compensate, driven by increased heart rate. Um, um, Next is ikatulo is stroke volume decreases due to reduced plasma volume. Ang number four is after several days. Ikaapat is after several days, muscles adapt to extract more oxygen, reducing demand for increases cardiac output. So at maximal exercises, um, at maximal exercises, first is kanang there are three, and first is kanang maximal stroke volume, heart rate, and cardiac output decrease. Number two is reduce diffusions, gradient, and maximal cardiac output limit to VO2 max and aerobic performance. So, these adaptations and limitations impair high intensity and prolonged aerobic activities at high altitudes.
So, what's up guys? Muna siyang continuation sa topic na Almi, which is the metabolic responses to altitude. So, at high altitude, the body's metabolism shifts to conserve oxygen and cope with hypoxia. This includes reduction in oxidative metabolism, increases glycolysis, and a decrease in the capacity of fatty acid oxidation. Additionally, there's an increased production of lactate and impaired mitochondrial functions. Metabolic responses to altitude, we have basal metabolic rate nga ga-increase, di ba? It increases thyroxine and catecholamines, acute decline to our appetite, and yun na. Then it increased reliance on carbohydrates for fuel at rest and during exercise of lactate paradox. Natay example ni sa atuang kuan. Ko unsaon ay example sa metabolic responses to altitude. We have the physiological responses to acute altitude exposure. In basal metabolic rate, ang thyroxine is kapataas, yung secretion taas. Then we have the catecholamine secretion mass, and about food sa atong food nga gina-intake or to maintain our body mass, that more reliance on glucose versus fat, and anaerobic metabolism, which is ang lactic acid niya gapataas po siya. Then lactic acid production is overtiming. Then there is a shift in shift in fuel utilization, which is the body is gina-prioritize niya ang glucose metabolism or the glycolysis over fatty acid oxidation. Muna ang gina-prioritize niya, which is ang glucose metabolism sa shift in fuel utilization. And we have reduced mitochondrial function, which is mitochondrial density and functions may decrease, particularly with prolonged exposure to extreme altitudes. And we have the increased lactate production. The shift to glycolysis leads to an increase in lactate production, which can be a marker of adaptation in some high altitude population. And napad siya hormonal and genetic adaptation. In hormonal and genetic adaptation, the hormonal changes such as it increases the levels of growth hormones and insulin, like growth factors, may also contribute to metabolic adaptations. Contribute siya mga metabolic adaptations. And respiratory alkalosis and kidney compensation. The hyperventilation at high altitude leads to a reduction in arterial CO2, which is the respiratory alkalosis, which is the kidney compensate for the increasing bicarbonate excretion. Then let's proceed to nutritional needs at altitude. At high altitude, individuals need to adjust their nutritional intake to support the body physiological changes and increased demands. Specifically, they should prioritize carbohydrates, rich foods, adequate protein intake, and increase fluid consumption, which also paying attention to iron and other micronutrients nga kailangan sa atong body. In addition to alterations in physiological system and process already described, several other considered actions are important to note with ascent to altitude. At altitude, the body has a natural tendency to lose fluids through the skin. Insensible water loss, which is kanang mahurot ang kanang liquid sa tong lawas, which is need na dahil nato nga mag-inom og tubig para masudlan or matubilan atong lawas sa kailangan nga tubig sa atong lawas. The respiratory system and the kidneys. This water loss is exaggerated with exercises as sweat evaporation increases from the from the wetted skin to the relatively dry air. These avenues of fluids loss dramatically increase the risk of dehydration, and one should pay careful attention to staying hydrated. And there is a nutritional needs at altitude. Muna siya itong mga kailangan sa itong lawas. We have energy, protein, hydration, fat, iron, carbohydrate, micronutrients, and vitamins and potassium. So let's start with energy. Sa energy guys, it has high altitude increases energy expenditure, so individuals needs to consume sufficient calories to balance this increase. And sa protein, it adequate protein is crucial for muscle repair and building, especially for climbers and athletes. Kani siya kay muni siya ang gahatag or ga produce atong lawas, or I mean muscle repair, ga-build siya muscle or gina-repair niya ang mga muscle bitaw nato, and muna siyang kailangan sa mga climbers or athletes, which is gamit of more muscle. Like syempre kung ang mga climbers or athletes kailangan din sila kuan sa muscle, di ba? Or sa sobraan o gamit sa, or sa sobra nila ka tawag niya in, di ba, mag example climbers kailangan nila og kusog, and mo ni siya ang purpose sa protein, which is gahatag siya og ga-repair siya sa mga muscles nga diba, or gina-build niya ang mga muscle nga na damage, especially para niya sa mga climbers and athletes. It aims for 3 or 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, with a focus on branch chain amino acid like leucine basta. And let's proceed to carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the body's preferred fuel source, and their intake can be adjusted to accommodate increases energy needs, potentially increasing to 80% of total calories during intense training session. And fat, while fat is calorie dense, it's often less palatable and tolerated at high altitudes due to the potential for gastrointestinal issues. Unsaturated oils from cooking, dressing, and natural sources like nuts should be favored. Hydration. It increases fluid intake. It increases fluids intake is essential at altitude due to increased respiratory and sweat losses. Dehydration can worsen the symptoms of altitude sickness. Iron intake before and during high altitude exposure is essential, as the increased erythropoietic drive at altitude increases the need for iron. This is particularly important for endurance athletes. Muna siya ang importante kani siya sa mga endurance athletes. And let's proceed to micronutrients. While specific micronutrients requirements at high altitude haven't been fully studied, some nutrients are of particular concern, such as those involved in energy transformation and antioxidant protection. And vitamins. We have vitamin C and E, along with other antioxidants, may be beneficial in combating oxidative stress associated with high altitude exercise and altitude sickness. And the last one is potassium. which is food rich in potassium can be beneficial for acclimating to altitude. In summary, a well-balanced diet at altitude should be prioritized. Ang dapat i-prioritize ani is ang iyang carbohydrates for energy and adequate protein for muscle repair and increases fluids intake to combat dehydration. Additionally, paying attention to micronutrients need, especially iron, zinc, is crucial for optimal health and performance at altitude. That's all for our part of this report. Thank you guys.
Altitude or atmospheric conditions. Although the percentage of oxygen stays the same, the partial pressure of oxygen drops as altitude increases. This makes it harder for our lungs to absorb oxygen. The air also becomes more colder and drier, increasing the risk of dehydration and cold-related illnesses. Additionally, the thinner the atmosphere, the more it intensifies the solar radiation, especially over snow. The body's response to altitude. The body faces hypobaric hypoxia, a state where less oxygen is available in the air. As the result, we breathe more rapidly and our heart works harder to circulate oxygen. Initially, red blood cell concentration increases due to the lower plasma volume. However, during intense exercise, the reduced oxygen delivery to the tissue becomes a major limitation. Next is VO2 max at altitude. VO2 max or maximal oxygen uptake begins to decline at around 1,500 meters and drops by 8 to 11% with every additional 1,000 meters. For endurance athletes, this significantly limits performance, while those with higher VO2 max have an advantage. Even they must work at lower percentage of their maximum capacity when at higher elevation. Anaerobic response at altitude. Interestingly, short-term anaerobic activities like sprint aren't as effective. That's because they rely less on oxygen and more on energy systems like ATP and glycolysis. In fact, thinner air at altitude reduces aerodynamics. In fact, thinner air at altitude reduces aerodynamic resistance. This helps athletes set records at the 1868 Olympics in Mexico City. Acclimation to altitude. Acclimation takes time. At moderate altitude, it takes about 3 weeks for the body to adjust. For every 600 meters increase, about a week is added. But even then, full compensation is never achieved. Once back at sea level, all gains begins to fade within a month. Pulmonary adaptation. Within a few days at 4,000 meters, resting ventilation can increase by around 40%. During exercise, this increase can reach 50%. These changes help improve oxygen uptake despite the thinner air, but they take time and depend on exercise, intensity, and duration. Blood adaptation. Low oxygen triggers the kidney to release erythropoietin or EPO, which boosts the red blood cell production. Over weeks to months, blood volume and hemoglobin content increases. These changes improve oxygen transportation, especially with continued exposure above 4,000 meters. Muscle adaptation. Muscle adapt too, but not always in a helpful way. Muscle fiber decrease size after a week of altitude exposure. Although capillary density increased to improve oxygen delivery, the overall ATP production capacity and oxidative metabolism often decline, reducing muscular endurance. Cardiovascular adaptation. Interestingly, even after acclimation, aerobic capacity and VO2 max remain sea level values. Athletes can train at the same intensity and altitude, which makes maintaining performance more difficult without careful management. At high altitude, health risk is inevitable. Altitude carries health risk, and these are the examples. First is AMS. It causes headache, nausea, and insomnia. HAPE is a life-threatening fluid buildup in the lungs. HACE is a fluid buildup in the brain, leading to confusion and potentially death. This condition requires immediate descent and oxygen therapy. Altitude training. Altitude training uses hypoxic environment to stimulate red blood cell production. It's best performed between 1,000 to 300 meters. Athletes should start at 60 to 70% of sea level intensity and build up over 10 to 14 days. These gains can boost sea level performance, though effects are temporary. In summary, high altitude limits endurance due to reduced oxygen availability. Aerobic activities might benefit from the reduced air resistance. Successful altitude training and acclimatization help athletes adjust, but best strategy remains: live high, train low.
Hi everyone! For my topic, we are going to talk about why it is so hard to exercise at high altitudes. First of all, from the word altitude, we are talking about height. Like sa iyang katason. Like how high you are above sea level. So when we say high altitude, we mean places that are way up, like on the mountains. The higher you go, the thinner the air gets, and that means that there less oxygen available for our bodies to use. Because of that, even mga simple movement nato, like walking or climbing, can feel like like lisod kaayo siya buhaton sa atong nangaandan. And you get tired faster, you breathe heavier, and your muscles don't get as much oxygen as they used to. So, there's this story from 1925 about a climber named E.G. Martin. He was climbing at 8,600 meters, that is about 28,000 feet, without using any extra oxygen. And he said that their pace was terrible. He tried to challenge himself to take 20 steps uphill without stopping to catch his breath, but he couldn't do it. Most of the time, he could only manage about 13 steps before he had to stop and rest. This story just shows how much harder it is to move and do any physical activity when you are up so high. And even strong people, experienced climbers, have a really hard time. And maybe that's all for my topic, and I hope you learned something, and thank you for listening.